Amid Washington's tariffs and threats, Ottawa did not back down. Prime Minister Mark Carney not only refused to bow to Donald Trump, but also turned the trade chessboard into an arena exposing the United States' economic weaknesses, opening up a rare confrontation in which Canada holds the strongest card, not bowing before the storm. On August 1st, the moment Donald Trump eagerly imposed new tariffs as a warning blow to Ottawa became the very moment Canada rewrote the way it was perceived on the international stage. There were no weak pleas for peace, no concessions under pressure. Prime Minister Mark Carney chose a blunt message. Canada will not be coerced, will not be threatened, and will not accept artificial deadlines set up to gain political advantage. In the history of North American economic relations, there have been no shortage of moments when Canada was forced to improvise in response to unexpected decisions from the White House. But this time was different. Carney did not respond with a patchwork defensive stance. He proactively repositioned the game, shifting from a posture of enduring the blows to actively controlling the rhythm of negotiations. When Trump announced he would impose a 35% tariff on Canadian goods outside the scope of the USMCA, many expected Ottawa to quickly find an escape route to minimize damage. Instead, Carney pulled Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc out of Washington, a highly symbolic move. If a partner chooses to behave with ultimatums, then Canada has no reason to sit at the table just for form's sake. What surprised observers was not only the act of withdrawing the negotiation team, but the way Carney packaged this message with a calm demeanor. No loud gestures, no personal attacks. He simply said, "We represent Canada's interests and will only sign agreements that are good for Canada." Those words, in a context where the U.S. market was already wobbling, carried more weight than any long-winded speech. They showed that Ottawa was fully aware of its position, and more importantly, that it knew the other side of the negotiating table needed a deal just as much, if not more, than Canada did. At a deeper level, this was not merely a trade move. It was a rejection of the good little brother role that Canada had been tagged with for decades. Carney understood that if he accepted negotiations under the shadow of threats, this precedent would carry over to every other area, from energy policy to security to diplomacy. Therefore, instead of trying to patch up the bilateral relationship with hasty concessions, he chose to send the message that Canada can and will find its own way, even if it means looking beyond the continent. In that context, pulling Minister LeBlanc out of Washington was a double-edged move. Domestically, it showed that the federal government was willing to endure short-term pressure to protect long-term interests, sending a strong signal to the business community that Ottawa would not sign an agreement just to quiet things down. Internationally, it forced the U.S. to face reality. The Canadian market, a major buyer of American goods, could absolutely reduce its dependence if forced. What is notable is that Carney chose to deliver this strike at a time when U.S. financial markets had already begun showing signs of instability. This was the tactic of a former central bank governor, knowing when to remain silent and when to strike so that the psychological effect would ripple outward. This approach was entirely different from the usual hot-blooded tit-for-tat often seen in trade politics. It made it harder for the U.S. to react out of habit, forcing them to recalculate the cost of continuing to escalate tensions. Carney's decisiveness also reflected a new reality in North American relations. The balance of power no longer leaned entirely toward Washington. In a world where supply chains are more diversified and new markets are emerging across Asia, Africa, and South America, Canada is no longer in a position of being inescapably tied to America's economic shadow. This shift did not happen overnight, but this move laid the foundation for it, a reminder that Ottawa has options and is ready to use them. From a strategic standpoint, this was a challenge not only to Donald Trump, but to the entire U.S. mindset of negotiating through pressure. Carney, with his experience steering two major central banks, understood the psychological factor in the global economy. When a leader knows how to turn pressure into an advantage, the opponent is forced to either step back or accept an escalation of risk. And in this match, at least at that moment, Canada had forced the U.S. to recalculate every move. By placing national interests above all political courtesies, Carney not only held the line, but also elevated Canada's position on the trade chessboard. This was not a momentary act of resistance, but a long-term message. Ottawa will never sign a deal just to escape, and will never bow before the storm, even if it comes from the White House. The tariff blow and the market turning point. When Donald Trump signed the order to raise import tariffs on Canadian goods outside the scope of USMCA from 25% to 35%, the White House seemed to have delivered a fatal blow. The announced tariff increase was not just a political message, but also a public challenge to Ottawa. Either accept America's terms or bear the economic consequences. Yet reality proved the opposite. This tariff blow did not bring Canada to its knees, but became the catalyst for the country to steer its trade strategy in an entirely new direction. Carney and his cabinet understood the structure of bilateral trade well. About 85% of goods exchanged between the two countries remained protected under the USMCA framework, meaning that only a small but symbolic portion was affected by the new tariff rate. This allowed Ottawa to act not from a position of weakness, but from one holding the cards. If the U.S. wanted to use that 15% as leverage, Canada would turn it into the driving force to open other trade doors. Just days after the tariff announcement, Canadian trade delegations began moving. Brussels, Tokyo, Canberra, Mexico City, capitals across Central and South America, all appeared on the travel map of the ministers. These were not ceremonial visits, but closed-door meetings discussing bilateral agreements, expanding quotas, and reducing import tariffs. Ottawa set a clear goal: replace any market share lost in the U.S. with new contracts in markets hungry for high-quality, reliable goods. The choice of partners also reflected deep calculation. Europe, with the already signed CETA agreement, became a place where Canada could quickly boost exports without negotiating from scratch. Asia, especially Japan, South Korea, and CPTPP countries, opened strong consumer markets for agricultural products, seafood, and industrial raw materials. Africa, though emerging, brimmed with growth potential and needed technology and infrastructure that Canada could provide. And Mexico, the other USMCA member, could not be overlooked, as it was ready to seize the opportunity to increase trade with Ottawa, thereby jointly reducing dependence on U.S. goods. What is notable is that these moves were carried out alongside maintaining stability in the domestic market. The government quickly rolled out a support package for export businesses directly affected by the new tariff rate, from preferential credit and trade risk insurance to international trade promotion. Industry associations, from steel and aluminum production to food processing, were encouraged to participate in international fairs, seek new partners, and even form temporary alliances to increase competitiveness. For Carney, this was not just a story of coping. It was a historic opportunity to redraw the map of Canada's trade. He once said in a closed-door session with businesses, "Every time one market closes, at least 3 other doors will open, if we are fast enough and bold enough to step through." This very spirit turned the tariff shock into a driving force for a comprehensive export strategy reform. Across the border, many American experts began to notice the side effects of the new tariff policy. As Canadian orders gradually shifted toward Europe and Asia, American exporters lost the geographic proximity advantage that had helped them compete on price with global rivals. In fact, some U.S. industries, such as machinery manufacturing or food processing, faced reverse pressure when raw materials imported from Canada became more expensive, forcing them to seek lower quality or more distant alternatives. Trump's tariff blow, politically, may have made waves among protectionist-leaning voters, but economically, it was a double-edged sword. By skillfully turning pressure into opportunity, Canada not only protected its immediate interests, but also expanded its trade space for the next decade. This put the U.S. in a strange position. The longer the high tariffs remained, the more they pushed Canada out of the economic orbit Washington sought to maintain. Perhaps this is the biggest difference between an impulsive reaction and a well-crafted strategy. Trump wanted to create a shock to force the opponent to back down. Carney used that shock as a springboard to climb to a new rung. And when the board changes, it's not only Ottawa or Washington that feels the impact. The entire North American trade network will have to rethink its moves. The shockwave on Wall Street. In the days after Ottawa firmly held its ground and refused to concede to Washington, the electronic boards in New York lit up red. Not because of an unexpected global financial storm, but due to the ripple effects of a political trade confrontation that seemed to be merely a bilateral conflict between the U.S. and Canada. The Dow Jones slipped 1%, the S&P 500 lost 1.6%, and the Nasdaq fell by as much as 2.2%. Numbers that at first glance might not seem catastrophic, yet carried deep psychological significance. This was a signal that investors were beginning to worry not only about trade tensions, but also about the political stability of the White House. After all, the decision to impose tariffs and clash with Canada did not occur in a vacuum. It came at the exact moment U.S. job data showed the worst figures since the 2008 crisis. This picture caused many major investment funds to immediately adjust their portfolios, shifting capital into gold, government bonds, and even emerging markets in Asia. Wall Street, long accustomed to short-term shocks, this time sensed the risk of a prolonged disruption. When a top trade partner like Canada proactively diversifies its markets, long-established supply chains will be broken, and American businesses will have to pay higher prices for raw materials, components, and even food. The impact was not just in the statistical figures. Market sentiment always carries an emotional element, and the image of a calm, steadfast Canadian Prime Minister facing Trump's threats only highlighted the instability on the U.S. side. Investors hate uncertainty. When they cannot predict the administration's next move, they start pulling capital, going defensive, and pushing the market into a spiral of sell-offs. This shock was amplified by reactions within the Trump administration. In a rare and controversial move, the president fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics just hours after the jobs report was released. The official reason was incompetence, but everyone knew this was an attempt to erase the negative image from the unemployment data. Yet instead of reassuring the market, the move deepened Wall Street's concern. If data is politicized, how can there be a transparent basis for economic forecasting? Amid this turmoil, many U.S. corporations heavily dependent on Canadian raw materials or components began to sound the alarm. Steel, aluminum, and auto industry associations repeatedly lobbied, urging the White House to seek negotiation rather than escalate confrontation. Some even warned that if the situation dragged on, jobs in key industrial states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania would be severely affected, states where Trump needs votes more than ever. From a political economy perspective, this was a rare moment where the stock market, employment data, and international trade strategy intersected. Wall Street was not reacting merely to losing a few percentage points in market capitalization. It was reacting to the realization that U.S. foreign policy was shifting from long-term calculations to decisions tinged with personal, emotional, and unstable impulses. Meanwhile, Carney and his advisory team in Ottawa capitalized on this very sentiment to strengthen their position. They understood that every slip in the NASDAQ or every gloomy unemployment report would weaken Trump's argument about overwhelming U.S. economic strength. This was not only an advantage at the negotiating table, but also created reverse pressure from within the U.S. business community and investors on the White House. There is a paradox here. Trump wanted to use economic strength to force Canada to yield, but by triggering insecurity in the market, he handed Carney a new strategic lever. And when that lever combines with a trade network expanding across the globe, the balance of power in this North American showdown is tilting toward Ottawa. Not on the tariff battlefield, but right in the heart of America's financial world, Wall Street. The wave of saying no to American goods. If the upheaval on Wall Street was a shockwave in the financial world, then north of the border, another wave quietly spread, but was no less powerful: the movement to boycott American goods. It began with calls on social media, then quickly turned into collective action. From supermarket shelves to tourist destinations. Canadians are known for their calm demeanor, but when they feel imposed upon and disrespected, national solidarity flares up strongly. Videos showing consumers choosing made-in-Canada products instead of imports from the U.S. spread at lightning speed. Small shops hung signs saying, "Support local goods," as both a declaration and a challenge. What's notable is that this movement was not only born from wounded national pride, but also from very practical economic calculations. When the U.S. government imposed high tariffs, the prices of American goods in Canada rose sharply. For many families, choosing local goods was not only an act of patriotism, but also a way to save money. And from a business perspective, this was a golden opportunity to reclaim market share once dominated by American products. The campaign's reach did not stop at Canada's borders. In Australia, Europe, and even some African nations, organizations and consumer groups expressed support by limiting the import or consumption of American goods. In Mexico, local authorities skillfully turned U.S.-Canada tensions into a driver for new cooperation with Ottawa, from trade to tourism. Tourism was a clear example. In the past, millions of Canadians traveled to the U.S. for shopping and vacations each year. But when the call "spend money where we are respected" rang out, travelers began to change course. Mexico, the Caribbean, Europe, and even domestic Canadian destinations saw a surge in bookings. Each trip was not just a vacation, but a soft political statement carrying weight. Provinces, which sometimes have conflicting interests, this time coordinated in a rare show of unity. Local governments not only encouraged people to support domestic products, but also rolled out packages to support production and marketing for businesses. On television, radio, and social media, the Buy Canadian campaign appeared everywhere, turning the slogan into a part of daily life. The psychological factor cannot be overlooked. Every Canadian product sold at this moment carried added symbolic meaning. Consumers felt they were adding a brick to the wall, protecting national interests. Businesses felt they were not alone in the competition. And policymakers had more grounds to maintain a tough stance in negotiations. The wave of saying no to American goods was, in essence, a form of strategic counterattack. It required no new weapons or tariffs, yet it directly impacted America's key export sectors, sending the message that economic strength lies not only in GDP figures, but also in the choices of millions of consumers. And once those choices are born from pride and unity, they can become a resistance stronger and more enduring than any official retaliatory measure. The silent shift of power. As the movement to boycott American goods continued to spread, and the U.S. stock market had yet to recover, another development quietly began reshaping the regional economic power landscape: the shift in trade relations and strategic alliances. This was no longer a story of tariffs or pure import-export figures, but a long-term restructuring process in which Canada was skillfully pivoting to turn pressure into advantage. Ottawa understood that if it only reacted at the consumer level, the boycott movement would create merely short-term impact. Therefore, the Carney government proactively launched a series of visits to Europe, Asia, and South America to strengthen existing trade agreements while signing ambitious new ones. In these meetings, Canada not only offered agricultural products, minerals, or green technology, but also positioned itself as a stable, reliable partner. A stark contrast to the unpredictable fluctuations coming from Washington. The key point here was timing. At a moment when international businesses were wary of the volatile America First policy, Canada appeared as a safe haven. Many multinational corporations that had previously placed their regional headquarters in the U.S. began considering expanding or relocating part of their operations to Toronto, Vancouver, or Calgary to reduce political and trade risks. This meant that the flow of foreign direct investment, FDI, into Canada tended to rise sharply, driving job creation and a boom in supporting service industries. At the same time, Carney leveraged the diplomatic network to form soft alliances against U.S. imposition policies. Without loud declarations, but through closed-door meetings and international forums, Ottawa and its partners built mechanisms for consultation, position coordination, and market support for one another. Even just sharing information and synchronizing trade defense measures created a collective strength strong enough to reduce the impact of Washington's pressure tactics. Domestically, the federal government took advantage of a rare consensus among political parties to accelerate support packages for exporting businesses. From tax incentives, research funding, to expanding maritime and rail routes to Asia, all aimed at reducing dependence on the U.S. market. The political atmosphere in Ottawa, usually divided, was now united by a common goal: to protect and elevate the nation's position. The psychological impact of these moves could not be underestimated. When the business community saw the government acting decisively, they were ready to invest in long-term plans instead of merely hunkering down defensively. When people saw that new trade agreements brought job opportunities and stable prices, they became even more convinced that confronting the U.S. was the necessary path to safeguard long-term interests. And here, an ironic paradox emerged. The tariffs and tough policies from Washington, designed to force Canada to yield, became the catalyst for Ottawa's autonomy and bargaining power. Quietly, without fanfare, Canada was step-by-step building an economic-political network that made America's position in the region no longer absolute. The game had now changed. Power no longer rested solely in the hands of those who imposed tariffs, but also with the nation that knew how to turn pressure into expanded strategic space. And in this match, Canada was proving that sometimes the greatest strength comes from steadfastness and long-term calculation, something not every superpower can maintain. When trade intersects with geopolitics. Amid tariff calculations, trade charts, and international agreements, an element seemingly outside the scope of the negotiating table suddenly became the focal point of tension. Palestine. Canada's official recognition of the Palestinian state was not only a humanitarian and diplomatic decision, but also a strategic variable disrupting the entire trade game with the U.S. From Washington's perspective, especially under the Trump administration, Ottawa's move was seen as an indirect challenge to U.S. Middle East policy. Instead of maintaining a strategic silence like many other Western allies, Canada chose to side with the two-state solution, while speaking out strongly on humanitarian issues in Gaza. This move triggered a chain reaction, as some European and Latin American countries expressed support for Ottawa's stance, while some of Washington's close allies appeared hesitant. Trump, long accustomed to using the economy as a tool of pressure, quickly turned the Palestine issue into a reason to delay or refuse trade negotiations. For him, this was not merely a dispute over political viewpoints, but an opportunity to test Canada's endurance. Was Ottawa willing to trade economic interests to uphold its foreign policy principles? But if Trump's goal was to force Canada to back down, he miscalculated Carney's mindset. Coming from the financial world but deeply knowledgeable about international politics, Carney clearly saw one reality. In the 21st century, trade and geopolitics do not exist in isolation. A firm political stance can sometimes serve as the passport to strengthen economic alliances. Indeed, immediately after the announcement recognizing Palestine, Canada received numerous invitations to join international forums, particularly from resource-rich Middle Eastern nations and emerging markets seeking reliable partners outside the U.S. investment capital. From this region began flowing into Canada's infrastructure and clean energy projects. These were investments not only of economic value, but also binding both sides in deeper political diplomatic relationships. Domestically, the stance on Palestine created a certain division in public opinion, but not enough to shake the government's resolve. On the contrary, many saw it as proof that Ottawa was willing to defend moral values even when facing pressure from its superpower neighbor. This reinforced Canada's image as a principled player on the international stage, a rare quality in a context where nations often compromise for short-term interests. The U.S. might think it was isolating Canada, but in reality, it was opening space for Ottawa to connect with partners it had previously had little chance to approach. The Palestine issue, once purely a humanitarian and political matter, had now become a catalyst for restructuring global trade relations. And while Trump continued to try to exploit the issue as leverage, Carney skillfully turned it into a diplomatic card, linking economic interests with humanitarian values. At the intersection of trade and geopolitics, Canada was proving that some principles are not for sale. And sometimes, those very principles open new paths an opponent never saw coming. The cold hand on the hot chessboard. Mark Carney is not the type of politician who likes to create loud moments to draw cameras. He is the kind of person who walks into a meeting room with a thin folder, a few brief notes, and a gaze that makes everyone at the negotiating table adjust their breathing. Years of steering the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England have trained him to closely observe every economic movement, listen to the smallest signals from the market, and from there find his opponent's weak point. In the showdown with Trump, all those skills suddenly became sharp weapons. Trump is used to opponents reacting hastily, conceding to avoid immediate damage. But Carney played to a different rhythm, patient, cold, and almost without revealing emotion. He understood clearly that the U.S. economy was treading on thin ice, an unstable labor market, declining consumer confidence, and both public and private debt reaching worrying levels. For someone who had managed a global financial crisis, this was like seeing cracks beneath the surface of an iceberg and knowing exactly which point would break first. Instead of rushing the dialogue, Carney chose to let time work for him. Every day the U.S. hesitated to sign a new agreement was another day their own market created more pressure. Thanks to alternative trade channels that had been expanded beforehand, Canada did not immediately fall into a strangling position. This allowed Ottawa to both preserve its domestic position and let Washington feel the weight of its own wrong decisions. Carney also knew how to leverage another kind of capital beyond money: international credibility. In financial circles, he was not only a former central bank governor, but also the architect of many post-2008 financial crisis reforms. When he spoke about the global economic outlook or the policy risks of the U.S., markets listened. That trust gave his message influence far beyond the bilateral Canada-U.S. scope, while indirectly pressuring the White House. Another factor that allowed Carney to hold the strong card was his ability to skillfully combine economic goals with humanitarian values. When he announced aid packages for Gaza or reconstruction support in conflict zones, the message sent to the world was not only compassion, but also the affirmation that Canada was confident enough to act independently, even when it went against the wishes of the U.S. This reinforced Ottawa's position as a reliable partner, an intangible asset that Washington, no matter how much it wanted to, could hardly compete with. On the burning chessboard of international trade and politics, Carney was playing with a cold hand, steadfast and calculated in every move. He was not seeking an immediate victory only to pay the price later. Instead, he was reshaping the game, turning U.S. challenges into opportunities to expand Canada's influence into new markets and alliances. In the eyes of many, this was not merely a trade confrontation, but a peak performance in the art of strategic leadership, where patience does not mean passivity and principles do not mean rigidity. With this approach, Carney was not only countering Trump, he was sending a broader message. In today's turbulent world, real power does not lie in shouting loudly at the negotiating table, but in the ability to remain calm, read the situation accurately, and wait for the precise moment to deliver the decisive blow.